Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator at Redwind Consulting, and I want to welcome you to the webinar. Today we'll be covering safety planning in your transitional housing program. Presenting today will be Raquel DeHerrera. Raquel is the current supervisor of the HSEA Advocacy Program and has been with Redwind for over 3 years. She has been a trainer for the National Tribal Advocate Center and has experience working with tribal housing authorities and Native programs nationally with strategic planning, capacity building, trauma-informed care, and more. I will now turn the call over to her.
Hi, thank you, Hanovi and Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join me for today's webinar. As Hanovi has mentioned, I'm the Program Director of the HSEA Advocate Program. We're a project of Redwind, and we're a local advocate program here in Colorado Springs, serving our Native community. We work under a couple of grants. Some of the services we provide are crisis response, and that includes immediate safety planning, needs assessment, risk assessment, emergency shelter through hotel, or referrals, and some emergency financial assistance. We also have a transitional housing program, and with that we provide rental subsidies, relocation assistance, safety planning, and support services. For today's webinar, I'm going to talk about safety planning in your transitional housing program. We will talk about the critical importance of safety planning, things to consider when safety planning in your transitional housing program, what your role as an advocate is when safety planning with the participant, safety planning according to the specific violence experienced, LGBTQ two-spirit safety planning, immediate and long-term safety planning, and challenging issues surrounding safety planning. Please feel free to ask any questions or make comments at any time. I'll periodically look at the comment section. I know that sometimes questions are better asked when in the moment about speaking on the certain content. So with that, we will get started, really thinking about the critical importance of safety planning. Safety planning is the foundation of our work. While we offer many services, safety planning is probably going to be the most critical work that we can do when working with our participants. Safety planning in a transitional housing program can simultaneously look similar and different from safety planning with someone in a crisis situation. And by that, I mean that you are more likely going to have a longer time with your transitional housing participant than you might have in your crisis program. So this will mean you're going to walk with them as they're healing from the violence in a more long-term space. So it's important to keep that in mind as you safety plan with your participant. Our role as an advocate while assisting the participant with safety planning really is not to do the plan with them or for them. It is to ask the questions that get our participants thinking critically about the specific tactics their partner used and how to stay safe. Education groups are incredibly helpful in providing information and just further words to explain intimate partner violence. And we'll talk more about education groups and things like that as we move along. So as we work with our participants in our transitional housing program, many needs come up, and it's important to emphasize the importance of safety planning on a consistent basis. So sometimes it might, as you're working with your participant, it's been 5 months and they're in the program and they just don't feel there's a need to safety plan. We just kind of want to encourage that we still kind of have these conversations and talk about safety planning even as they have moved out of more of a crisis situation. So it helps, create ways in which they can keep themselves safe from future violence, from the emotional, and we'll talk more about emotional safety planning as well. But it really is a key critical piece in our work that we do when working with participants. So just some things to consider. Safety planning in a transitional housing program is going to be ongoing.
1 second. Oh, I don't think our audio is connected anymore. What happened?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry.
Just wanted to make sure.
Our audio didn't pop up at the top anymore, so we wanted to make sure.
Oh, all right. So things to consider. So safety planning in a transitional housing program is ongoing. So even though they might have moved on past from the crisis stage, safety planning is still critical and important. So we want to continuously have the conversations, and we want kind of in how our program runs, whether that be through some protocol or just things that we, forms that we have, we want to make sure that safety planning is being done on a continuous basis and that there's an emphasis of importance on it. It's also going to depend on what type of housing you provide, whether that's scattered, on-site housing. For us, in our housing, we provide scattered transitional housing. So we have to look at many different things, whether that's routes to work, school, what is considered safe. Are they, is the apartment or housing going to be close to the abuser? So we really have to look at that and safety plan accordingly. We use in our housing program kind of a worksheet that as we're helping our participants find places to live, we have kind of a list where they can consider, is the apartment going to be on the lower level? Are there, do you have to park on the street, or is there a safe place that you can park? Is it heavily lighted? Are you isolated? Do you feel like this is a safe place? How are your routes to work and school going to look like? All of these things that you want to get them thinking about, and so that's just going to depend on the housing that you have. We also, because we are a scattered site, we don't have advocates available 24/7, so really that safety planning is critical in thinking about how participants can keep themselves safe, and really it depends on the circumstance. And so safety planning also will look different for each person. So what might work for someone in the past might not work for the participant you're working with. It really is important to keep that in mind. And some questions that I think are helpful in kind of determining individual needs are just asking, your participants some of these questions of, when do you think you are in danger? So getting the idea of, what you might think is not dangerous, they might think that otherwise, and it's really important for you to kind of understand that and get them thinking about that so they can critically think about, when do they feel like they're in danger. It's also important to ask what would help you feel safer, both physically and emotionally, especially in transitional housing and moving past a crisis moment. We do need to think about the physical safety, but also the emotional safety. So really, when we think about transitional housing and our participants getting into their home, that's when we can see a time where participants kind of just, now they're not in that crisis mode, and they're just, everything just comes to them, and so that's going to be really important for their emotional safety and well-being, to really help them prepare for what that might look like. So, especially if we have the holidays around this time of year. So if this is the first time a participant is celebrating alone, and that might, bring some things up. So we really want to make sure that we safety plan and identify that and what would make them feel safer or, just emotionally well. So asking those questions, and what have you done in the past to stay safe? I think this is important because it really is a strength-based approach. It really, addresses that participants are the experts of their own lives, that they have done so much to survive and to get to this point where they are healing from violence, moving away from the violence. And so when you ask them what did they do to feel safe, to stay safe, it really does emphasize that, they're really strong, that they have got themselves, here, and that they knew, even though we're safety planning and we have a word to call it, they were doing that all along. We're just here to kind of, here to help further, some some skills and some ways to safety plan and keep themselves safe. And then it also just gives you an idea of what specific tactics partners used. So, some use economic violence differently. So some, don't allow their partners to work, while others, they work and the abuser stays home. So just really understanding the different dynamics will be helpful when it comes to helping with safety planning. I think the critical piece here is it will also help you as an advocate not to assume anything. Sometimes, this is the work that we do. We kind of have this idea of knowing what might be best for people and assuming, that this is what the violence looks like. So really, we don't want to assume anything. We definitely want to consider each individual person that we're working with. And then this also I can go with considering participants' needs. So the resources that you're going to have to help find in order to keep participants safe. You will understand more if you understand their needs. Ask them what their needs are. That's going to be specifically important when referring to resources out in the community. Some community concerns might look like, I think that it's pretty big in our community. Most of our Native communities can be small, where everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows who the advocate is. So, not only developing a plan of the participants when they are out in the community for gatherings, you definitely want to consider how do you safety plan with that emotionally. An often thing that comes up here, and we are in an urban area, but it comes up when we have, local Native events and participants know that their abusers and their families will be there, or, they still want to go. How do they prepare themselves emotionally to go and be okay? So you're definitely going to want to think about triggers and some coping skills to help in that safety plan. And also, I think it's important to have a safety plan, when you do see a participant outside of work. So what will that look like? Sometimes it, might be you don't acknowledge each other just for safety reasons. And you want to make sure that you are clear with your participant about that, because you don't want to not ever bring it up and then you see them in public and you completely just don't acknowledge them, and that might be not the nicest thing on the participant's end to feel or to experience. So definitely having that into your safety plan as well, as far as a community. Something else to consider and think about is just what kind of transitional housing program you have. So if you have a site, on-site housing, everyone's going to know that might know it's a domestic violence transitional housing program. So just making sure that you're making sure locations are confidential, and how to safety plan for that. So that will be important. And another important thing is conflict of interest. So if you have a conflict of interest, it will be critical to address that and maybe ask that another advocate work with that participant, just for safety planning purposes, for confidentiality, and just probably the best practice is to consider those conflict of interest. So thinking about what our role specifically is as an advocate, and we have, when it comes to safety planning, there are a lot of dynamics, but really what's going to be important is identify current and long-term needs for safety. So current safety might look at finding housing away from where the abuser lives, or finding different routes to work. And then long-term, we'll look at how to safety plan when meeting with an abuser when it's their turn to have the children. So how would you safety plan with that? Maybe always bringing someone with, coping with triggers that might bring, the emotional safety planning. So it's going to look very different, not only from participant to participant, but with the participant and from the timing. So, the very beginning can be focused on something completely different from, towards the end of the time that they are in the program. One thing that we really do with our participants, we have a goals packet, and one of them is safety planning goals. And so we have kind of the short-term goal for safety planning, a midterm kind of, where they want to be in the middle, and then long-term safety planning goals. And that really helps us kind of identify some of those things. So the resources they might need currently will look very different from what they might need long-term. And so that's definitely going to be important for that. And then helping identify resources that can help maintain safety. We, fortunately, in Colorado have an address confidentiality program where our participants, because we're a scattered site, the lease is in their name, and their address can be a safety concern. So the address confidentiality program provides an opportunity for them to get a permanent address, and they'll give them this address, and I think I don't even know, it's just an address, and then it gets forwarded to their address and keeps it confidential. And so that's something, identifying resources that can help maintain that safety is going to be important, especially thinking about the example before, where meeting an abuser when you have to, take your kids for the abuser's turn to have them. We have also a program where you can get someone to kind of be there and help mitigate that. So just making sure you identify resources. And then if you don't have some of these resources, how can you work through that? So, making sure someone's always with them when they are going to take their kids to the abuser for their time and things like that. So just really making sure you identify resources. And then another important piece with identifying resources, you want to make sure the resources you are referring to understand the dynamics of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence, because you really want to make sure that they kind of have an idea of how critical confidentiality is for safety planning. So whether that's, we have a program that helps with food boxes, but it's this list and you have to write your name on there, and we had to really advocate for, can we just put our name on, or a fake name or something to keep our confidentiality intact. So just making sure that you have a good relationship with those resources that you are referring to make sure that they are not, accidentally, unintentionally putting our participants at risk. And then you want to make sure when you do identify those resources, and if you can't kind of help mitigate reducing the risk of confidentiality or safety planning, then you really want to make sure that your participants understand that and know all the risks that could possibly happen with that. We also have in our transitional housing and in our community, I think a lot of communities will have the VI SPDAT, and where it's this kind of questionnaire where everybody gets access to this information, every organization. So you really want to make sure that if you do tend to go that route, that you just make sure they know that that might not keep their name completely confidential, and just let them be aware of that. And then thinking about engaged and be available for long-term safety planning. I think that's important as we do our work, even as they are beginning to exit the program. We want to make sure that, they know that even though they are exiting the program or that their time in our program is up, that they still can come and turn to us for, things such as safety planning, especially as, new relationships form. We want to make sure that we are opening that door to let them know that they are always welcome to come in for advocacy and assistance. And that's going to be where trust comes in. As participants get in new relationships, we want to develop a trusting relationship with our participants where they can openly talk about what's going on and if they feel safe in that relationship. Because oftentimes we definitely don't want to be left in the dark, if something else comes up while they're in our transitional housing program. We want to make sure that we are making ourselves available for that. And then we also want to think about fostering critical thinking skills in the participant. I think that's really a big piece, so that participants can really safety plan on their own, and not saying on their own that we're not here and available, but just really critically thinking about violence and how the dynamics were in their experience, to really get them thinking about what are some ways to keep themselves safe. I also think education groups are an excellent way to kind of foster this critical thinking, because in your education groups you can talk about the dynamics of power and control as well as historical violence against Native women. It provides words for experiences. I remember, I knew my first relationship wasn't the healthiest. And I remember going to my first domestic violence training, 40-hour training, and after that just thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't realize all of the things I was experiencing was part of domestic violence. So really thinking about how relationships, the dynamics of violence work can really give voices to women who, and victims and survivors can give voices to things they experienced, and also can, kind of take some of that self-blame that we see a lot of the time away. So thinking about that, just thinking about ways that you can foster critical thinking skills, whether that's through education groups or what we do. Like I said, we do a goals sheet with the safety planning, so we talk about things that are going on, kind of ask those questions, even though it might seem, every month that we ask that, like why, but things always come up. So what made you feel safe? They might say something very different the next month because they're thinking about it. So we definitely want to make sure that we're continuously providing opportunities where we, as advocates, can help foster critical thinking skills in our participants.
So really quick, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat. And then up near the top left, by the audio buttons, there is a little figure with a arm being raised. If you click on that, we will be able to see it, and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Definitely. Anytime that you feel that you have a question, please feel free to. We'll look continuously at the chat box. All right, so it's going to be important to safety plan according to the violence experience. So even though a lot of things are similar with domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking, there are some differences that you might want to consider when safety planning. So with domestic violence, you're really wanting to think about identifying tactics the abuser used. So again, how did economic violence look like in their experience? How was minimization used? I mean, you really want to think about the tactics they specifically use and have participants really think about those tactics. I remember working with someone, and she didn't really feel, she knew something was wrong, and that's why she came into the office, but didn't really know. And kind of like my experience, where it's like you knew it wasn't healthy, but we have this idea of domestic violence as being, you have, I think society makes it, you have black eyes that you cover up, and this is what it looks like. Well, showing the participant the dynamic, the power and control wheel completely I remember just her breaking down and crying because these tactics that she didn't realize were part of that violence, after seeing that, it really validated what she was experiencing, and it really put it in perspective for her that, safety planning was really critical for her at that time. So thinking about that, we really want to make sure that we're providing information in our office. So whether that's power and dynamic, our power and control wheels, those type of things, we really want, when we're safety planning, you want to use that as a tool to kind of get participants critically thinking about their experiences. You're going to want to think about custody exchanges. So again, what will that look like? Can you safety plan accordingly to that? Make sure it's in a public place. Have someone go with you. If there are resources that can help mitigate some of that risk, then how can you access those? So definitely recognizing that also tactics shift. So as participants move forward, we know that sometimes tactics can be shifted. So just making sure that you understand that. For domestic violence, court dates and appointments with other systems. So how do you emotionally safety plan for participants who will have to be in the same courtroom as their abuser? So safety planning, the emotional safety planning piece is going to be important with that. Support systems and creating healthy boundaries. So we really, as advocates, want to role model what healthy boundaries might look like. And so that they can, take their ownership of boundaries and be, can work forward on that, as well as intersections of oppression and violence. We're going to want a safety plan as well. So again, using the court system and thinking about interactions with maybe child protection services and how the intersections of oppression, our identities, racism, sexism, all of these things, how that impacts their experiences even after being away from, their relationship, how they're still going to feel some level of oppression there. So really thinking about domestic violence, that's some of the things that you want to consider. Again, with sexual assault, we want to identify resources such as a sexual assault nurse examiner, and make sure that the resources that we are, using are trained to be victim and survivor centered. And so when you identify those resources, you want to make sure that you know what the process will look like so that you can kind of safety plan with them, but also prepare them for what might a SANE exam look like, what to expect. That's going to be really helpful when thinking about the emotional safety of our participants. You're going to want to identify triggers and how to safety plan for when they do have triggers. So really thinking about, some of those questions we talked about, that's going, when did you feel that you weren't safe? What did you do to kind of keep yourself safe in the past? That will be helpful in identifying some triggers. But then, as you move forward into the more long-term safety planning, maybe think about creating a journal where, they can identify when they had a really intense moment because of a trigger, and kind of think about, identify how they felt physically, emotionally, and then kind of what were some of their coping skills that they turned to when feeling triggered. So kind of identifying the triggers and then identifying whether, there are healthy coping skills being used and how you can safety plan accordingly. And we'll talk more about that, some of that in challenging issues. But really thinking about identifying triggers will be important for sexual assault survivors in our transitional housing program, and finding ways to have healthy coping skills or just to kind of mitigate some of that intense feelings. An example could be, maybe a smell, a certain smell of cologne or a certain smell just triggers them back to feeling unsafe and going back to the sexual assault. So maybe thinking about carrying something like lavender or something, essential oil with them to kind of help ground them and center them. So that can be part of that safety plan, what that looks like. And then safety planning for the legal process is going forward. So really safety planning for when victim blaming happens on the defense side, which we all know happens, where more often than not, the participant's going to be on trial. So really preparing them for some of those realities. So victim blaming, really having to defend, why they chose certain things. So really making sure that they are aware and plan for that. And also safe support systems. So making sure that we help them think about who are their safe support systems. Sometimes it's not always family, and sometimes it's not always friends. So really, how do we help recognize who their safe support systems are, and if they don't really have any, how do we create, opportunities for them to find safe support systems? And that just goes along with really making sure that they're not isolating themselves, which we know can sometimes happen after trauma, or even, that's a dynamic of domestic violence, but you really want to make sure that you're recognizing safe support systems. And for dating violence, a key piece might be safety planning for minimization from friends and family and how to respond. I think especially amongst, youth and young adults where dating violence might be minimized, where, oh, you're just dating, that's just dating, kind of minimizing some of these things. An example might be, a person gets into a new relationship and all of a sudden, they're not hanging out with friends and family, and kind of family just minimizing it, saying, oh, that's what happens when you, find somebody, but really thinking about how to safety plan with that minimization and how to talk to family members and your friends, or, help your participants to be able to talk to their family and friends about the seriousness of dating violence. Technology safety is going to go right along with that. Facebook, using, I think it's Instagram and Snapchat, really thinking about how social media and the social community can be used to vilify the participant and further isolate with retaliation. We see that a lot, especially amongst friends, using social media to really vilify our participants. And with that means, as advocates, we definitely want to make sure that we are aware of technology and what's being used, and be familiar with it. So, if you don't have a Facebook and you don't want it, that's totally fine, but make sure you have an idea of what Facebook looks like, so that what are some risks with Facebook, what are some risks with social media, so that you can transmit that to the participant. I remember with iPhones, you can, if the abuser knows your I think it's your Apple password, and you have kind of a linked phone where you're on the same billing, they can completely find out where you are. I know my partner, when I travel a lot, he knows exactly where I am at every moment because he has my password. And, for safety, it's for safety reasons for us, but, in a relationship where there's potential risk of that, you want to make sure that your participant is aware of that and how to change that or change your password. So it's really going to be important for you as an advocate to be aware of technology safety and what that looks like. And so part of safety planning might we think about safety planning as being a direct conversation and action between a participant and an advocate, but it could also look like really educating yourself on these things. So taking a social media technology safety, attending a webinar or going to a training, being familiar with those things will really be helpful when thinking about how to help safety plan when it comes to technology safety. And then, just going back to dating violence, identifying resources such as protection orders and state laws. So there are some states where if you're a certain age and it's dating violence, you can't get a protection order. So you want to make sure that you're aware of your state laws, your tribal codes, law codes, the federal standards when it comes to dating violence and protection orders. So just being aware of that. And then just how to navigate life after the change, after, with dating violence, moving forward in our transitional housing program. It might, again, with the minimization, oh, well, you weren't married, you were just dating, you should move on from it, like there wasn't that big of an impact, and we know that's not true. And so really helping them navigate the, that feeling that, family and friends might minimize that because, they were only dating. So thinking about that and how their experiences are valid, how it was not okay, and that how to kind of safety plan with themselves, when they hear family and friends say something like that, and then maybe how to kind of stop some of that minimization while in the process. So thinking about that, dating violence can be really, there's just different dynamics that we need to think about. The same goes for stalking. You want to identify resources. So one thing that we consider, again, the address confidentiality program and free phones. So making sure that you find resources where maybe you can get a free phone if there is stalking going on. And then you want to make sure that when you safety plan that they keep their old phone where, the abuser is trying to communicate with them, but only keep it for documentation and don't use it, and then use the other phone for other things. So trying to find a free phone would be helpful. A stalking log and documentation. One thing that would be really important is to document some of the things that they're experiencing, even though it might seem like it wouldn't matter if they document. Really, it will be important, especially as you get law enforcement involved. They're going to want to see kind of the log, the pattern of behavior that the stalking looks like. So making sure that they can do that, give them kind of a guide on what to document. Changing routes to school, work, and stores. So, not going to work the same way every time. And definitely letting school, work, and wherever you are kind of, know that this is what's going on, this is what the stalker looks like. If you see him, please know that this is risky, just to safety plan with that and informing others. And I know sometimes that might be hard where they don't want to inform bosses or, teachers that this is going on, and that you definitely have to maybe get to why they don't want to, and then let them just decide what's best for them, because sometimes they might lose their job if this is a pattern of behavior and they've lost their job 2 times now due to the stalking. Then yeah, they're probably not going to think informing their boss is going to be helpful. So just making sure that you individually ask them why they're choosing something that will be important, because it will help you understand a little bit more. And then acknowledge lethality risks and how to safety plan for those. We know when stalking and domestic violence are joined together that the lethality risk is astronomically high. So you want to make sure that you safety plan accordingly and that you let them know that, kind of that high risk, just so they know to kind of the extent what that might look like. And you definitely don't want to scare them, but you definitely want to inform them that, this can be worrisome, it can be fatal. And so really safety planning will be critical. with stalking, especially in transitional housing programs. As they're moving forward, abusers might decide that they are going to stalk them and really try to control them in different ways. And so we really want to make sure that you safety plan for that as well. So thinking about LGBTQ two-spirit safety, you really want to think about how is your transitional housing program responding appropriately. So that can go from the forms that you use. What kind of language are you using? Are you using gender neutral? So instead of using his or her, or, her, use they, them, theirs. Because really when you think about safety planning, you want to create an environment where people feel safe to come to you. And if you aren't using language that feels safe, then they're not going to come back, and that risks safety. So you really want to make sure that you're creating appropriate responses to the LGBTQ two-spirit community so that safety planning can happen. And so part of what that looks like is navigating oppressive systems. So, we know that LGBTQ two-spirit communities experience high levels of violence. And along with that, there's so many oppressive systems that they have to navigate through. And so really, you as an advocate to safety plan accordingly, you want to make sure that you are aware of these oppressive systems and how they don't work very well for the LGBTQ two-spirit community. You also want to think about when you're safety planning outing. So what will that look like for someone who really isn't out to the to their family, and if you're asking if they need to turn to their family for as part of a safety plan, what might that look like? And that might not be the safest place for them as well. So really thinking about the impact of that. Interactions with law enforcement, really making sure, like I said, safety planning isn't only between you and your participant. It really can be you as an advocate going to law enforcement and talking about the dynamics of LGBTQ two-spirit safety and why it's critical for them to understand those dynamics and to be aware of, some of the biases that they have. And especially with law enforcement, if someone has an ID and that's not their name and that's not who they're identifying themselves as, you should not, identify them as that. You really want to respect who they are as people, and so you really want to make sure that you are yourself aware of dynamics of LGBTQ two-spirit safety and how interactions with law enforcement might look like. We had a situation here where violence was going on in a lesbian relationship, and the police officers, they didn't think that it was a domestic violence situation. And we know that that's not the case, and that that's not appropriate, and that's definitely not legal. So we definitely had to help safety plan with our participant because, of course, they didn't feel that it was safe to call the police anymore. And then we also made sure that we talked with law enforcement advocates about these kind of things and to really open that conversation up. Again, so with our transitional housing, because we're a subsidy program and we're experiencing, as every community I feel is experiencing, high rates of apartments, the cost of living is incredibly high. And so sometimes it takes 4 to 5 months for participants to find a place to stay. So if an LGBTQ two-spirit person is waiting for a transitional housing room, or whether they're waiting to get, they're trying to find somewhere to live, you want to make sure that the shelters that you are referring them to are going to be appropriate. And that means, that they are not being discriminatory, that that it's appropriate and safe for LGBTQ Two-Spirit communities to go to. Here in the Springs, we have some shelters that most of our shelters are run in a very religious, by religious programs, and so that might not always be the safest thing for them. So you want to make sure to safety plan with that and thinking about resources, and again, educating the community about why it's important to really be appropriate in your response. And then layers of violence, thinking about our trans relatives and how the layers of violence experienced, whether it's sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, these layers of violence, they're violent. And so we really want to make sure that we are addressing that in our safety planning and validating that. And then with the judicial system, again, same with law enforcement, making sure that we are educating the community, but also when safety planning with the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community and our participants, the judicial system, if we have someone whose legal name is not how they identify, the judicial system, might not really respect their wishes to not be identified as what's on their ID. And so really safety planning with that participant, how emotionally, and validating them and letting them know that that's not okay, and that you really want to work hard to try and to educate systems on how harmful some of their policies and protocol and actions can be. So just thinking about some of those safety in the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community. Definitely, there are many resources, and you can email me. My email will be at the end of these slides, but if you have any resources or if you need resources for LGBTQ safety, that goes with educating ourselves to make sure that we are just knowledgeable on these things. Then going to immediate safety planning, you want to, assess the current risk, find relevant resources, consider the whole family needs. So I think oftentimes when we think about safety planning, it's pretty much the participant and the participant alone, but we know that for our participants, probably the highest need for safety is the safety for their children. So we want to make sure that we are, including the whole family in our safety planning. So that will be school safety. How do you inform school officials who can pick up, who cannot pick up, how to inform them that this is a situation that's going on, and if anything comes up, that's how you can safety plan with family, again with custody exchanges, work safety. So you really want to think about this immediate safety planning. Like I said, we have sometimes 4 months where participants are still looking for housing. So, that puts them in vulnerable situations where they are, might be at a shelter, they might be with, they might be in their car. So how do you stay safe while you're waiting for transitional housing? So that's going to be that immediate safety planning piece. And then to remember, participants are the experts in their own lives. They know what keeps them safe. They know the dynamics, and so you really just want to make sure that you are aware of that and you emphasize that with them as well. And so then while in transitional housing, you want to think about isolation concerns. So, again, getting into a new place, and whether you find that they might be isolating themselves or they feel isolated, you want to make sure that you safety plan for that and identify that and let them know that, bringing up safety planning might look like attending education groups, having, potlucks to bring participants together. You really want to make sure when you're safety planning, you create a safe environment where participants can find support systems. And then adapting to change, again, it's going to be really hard because most of the time we know that participants, they loved their partner, and they just wanted the violence to stop. And so, moving forward and in a place on their own, sometimes that adapting to change will be hard. So safety planning, with that, adapting to change, and then emotional safety kind of goes along with that. How can you emotionally provide safety? In our goals worksheets, we have, the safety planning, long-term, short-term, and part of that's spiritual. So, emotional safety planning might be, addressing that maybe they want to go to therapy, or maybe they want access to traditional healing options, or maybe they want to take up yoga or something, because that helps with their emotional safety, that helps create healthy coping skills. So you want to identify those and give them options and critically think about what makes them happy, what makes them, just incredibly happy, especially moving forward from violence. What did you do what could you not do that you always wanted to do now? What interests you? Those are going to be safety planning techniques where you really get them thinking about how they matter and how they get to live the life they've always wanted to, and that they have that power and control over themselves. While in transitional housing, court dates, of course, will come up, whether that's divorce, custody, anything like that. How do you safety plan with your participants to really identify those triggers and what can help mitigate some of the effects of those triggers? Custody changes we've talked about, and then thinking about what's next. So not only thinking about just the now and the past, but really the future. What's next for you? What are your long-term goals? Do you want to be, down the road, want to be in a healthy relationship? What do healthy relationships look like? How do you safety plan with that? So just thinking about some of those things in transitional housing will be helpful. And then the longer-term safety planning is refer to trauma supports. We know that trauma, and it doesn't go away overnight, and that it takes, it's going to take a lot of supports to kind of get you through some of those. So referring to those supports. Emotional safety will be critical at that time, as you are thinking about it longer term. Current and future relationships. Again, this is where education groups are important. You want to look at not only the dynamics of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence, but you want to look at maybe what should healthy relationships look like. And there are, we have some resources here at Redwood, I think, from Mending the Sacred Hoop, and if you want access to those, I can definitely email those. But having that around of what healthy relationships look like, to really get them thinking about, future relationships and what they want out of relationships and how to advocate for themselves to having healthy relationships. And then helping create and maintain those support systems, whether it's family. So even thinking about education groups, not just for participants, but maybe family and friends, to really understand the dynamics of violence and how, even if participants are no longer in that relationship, just how still the effects can be, how they can impact participants. So thinking about that longer-term safety planning will be important. And so kind of the hard stuff, I think, as an advocate, something that I had to learn really was that safety planning includes acknowledging and identifying risks of utilizing options for keeping safe or not. So the biggest thing is if you think something is probably not the safest for them, really having to step back and let them decide whether or not they want to use some of the things that you mentioned. That's going to be hard, but at the same time, we really want to think about victim and survivor autonomy. They get to make their own choices, and they're the experts on their life, and that might be the safest thing for them. So, maybe it's not, I don't consider it the safest when they're, continuously talking to the abuser. But that might be the participant's way of keeping themselves safe by not, kind of keeping them, not angry. So managing the behavior. But definitely you want to kind of address it. So, it is ultimately their choice, but just identifying how that might be not the safest or it is the safest, critically thinking about that and providing different options will be helpful too. And then thinking about challenging issues, so substance abuse, I think when we think about transitional housing and, when people are healing from the trauma, sometimes substance abuse happens, and that's just to kind of survive from the violence. And so you really, as an advocate, want to take an approach where it's more of a harm reduction approach where, you definitely, okay, if this is what your mind is telling you to do to survive, you want to create safe ways for them to do that. So safety planning, definitely a harm reduction safety plan will be important, but you also want to be, truthful and honest and really get them thinking about how do you think substance abuse is impacting your safety? How do you feel that this is impacting your future, the safety of your future, So thinking about that and creating trusting relationships where you can honestly go to each other will be helpful. Child protection services involvement, that's another big one where oftentimes participants who have, been in violent relationships, Child Protection Services says, well, you fail to protect your children. And so it might look like, when in your transitional housing program, it might look like, you're trying to provide stability so that they can get their children back. Those are going to be some challenging issues within your program, and how to safety plan accordingly to that is going to be, you're going to have to consider different options and be really creative in your safety planning. Again, the lack of housing. This is another big piece where it takes sometimes 4 months for our participants to find housing. So how do you keep safe when you don't have housing in those 4 months? Because you're, without housing and you're very vulnerable. So safety planning accordingly to that. Multiple layers of trauma. As Native people, we have intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and then we have traumas, whether it's in childhood and then, violence. So we really want to, there are layers of trauma that we need a safety plan for. So again, this is where education groups might come in, where, the historical roots of violence and thinking about how colonization and all of these things have been traumatic, and really uncovering some of the language for our participants to find will be critical. So not only safety planning for the violence, intimate partner violence, but safety planning for, whether it's microaggressions in the community and, institutional discrimination. Those are going to be things that you're going to want to consider in your safety planning. Job insecurity, having to go to court dates numerous times, missing work. You'll want a safety plan for that, what that might look like if they lose their job and they're having a hard time coming up with the 3rd month rent. How can you figure that out? And transportation is another big one. I know for us, and definitely in rural communities where, there's no transportation, some people could be walking long distances, and so that's another vulnerable piece. Waiting for the bus, all of those things you want to consider when safety planning with your participants. So you're going to want to know, what are your modes of transportation? What are going to be some of the safest bus routes to take? Safest roads? Are they lit very well if you're having to walk in the dark? And then finding resources maybe in the community that might be, we're fortunate we have a program that whenever they get cars donated, they pick families that they give those cars to. So making sure our participants are on those lists if they need cars is going to be helpful in that. And so some lasting thoughts are always follow up with your participants. So keep safety planning as kind of a foundation to your work. So every time you're in communication with your participants, talk about their safety. How are you feeling? How do you feel safe? What are some things that are coming up that where you don't feel safe? That's going to be important. Even when thinking about transitional housing, even if it doesn't feel safe in terms of directly related to the intimate partner violence, but maybe they're not feeling completely safe in their home for numerous reasons. Maybe they notice a lot of people in and out of the place next door to them, really navigating where they just don't feel safe. So it's going to be important to follow up. And remember, they're the experts of their own lives, that they make their choices. They know what will keep them safe. They've got themselves, they are here to this point. They've got themselves here at this point. Like, you really have to respect their autonomy. And you want to provide options, but never enforce them. So, be clear and upfront with the participants that you are only here to provide options, but you don't enforce them, and they're not required. And that, I think that's a big piece in our work. And that, remember, you are a part of their safety plan. I think when you create a trusting environment, the more likelihood they are going to come to you in a situation where they're not safe. So if you provide a trusting relationship where it's open and honest, they will feel that they can come to you if something comes up. Especially, I think, in transitional housing. I know in ours, you cannot be with your abuser. And so that's there, but I think you definitely want to let your participant know that your main priority is keeping them safe. So if they're worried that, okay, my abuser came over and, something happened, you want to make sure that they feel safe to tell you that, because you definitely don't want to be left in the dark with that. And then some lasting thoughts I didn't really put on the slide is really going to be facility safety. So how does your office feel safety-wise, whether you have a participant come in? Do you have an exit plan? How are your advocate offices how are the furniture arranged? So is your door closest, or is your chair closest to the door? Do you have kind of a protocol in place if something were to happen? Making sure that you have maybe law enforcement communication with them, saying, hey, if our location calls 911, here's a situation, please take that seriously and be here right away. So thinking about the facility safety, you really want to make sure. And then advocate safety. That batterers are generally targeting, our participant. However, there might be a time where they might target an advocate because you're working with their partner. So you want to make sure that you build practices that encourage the advocate safety as well. So whether that's informing fellow advocates where you're going, when they should expect you back, if you're not going to get back to the office, to at least let someone know that you made it to where you needed to make it, parking in lighted areas, making sure that car doors are locked, and always having your phone with you and charged, and having code words among staff for when to call the police in your office. That's going to be critical when thinking about safety planning. And if you need any further information on safety planning, on Redwind's website there is Creating Sister Space, and there is a section on safety planning, and there's a worksheet that you can fill out to kind of get you thinking about safety planning, what that looks like, how it takes place, what tools you'll use, and how the program will help safety planning become incorporated into the day-to-day thinking of the victim survivor. How will safety be addressed in your facility, addressed for advocates, And this is going to be big, how does what you are doing carry your vision and values? So you want to affirm the sacred, how do you affirm the sacredness of women? And I think this goes into, really reinforcing and assuring the participant that they are sacred and that they are deserving of safety and that they are in control of their lives. They are the experts of their lives, and that's going to be big in the way we work with our participants, the language we use. We want to recognize and support their sovereignty. So how is our safety planning going to do that? How are we going to adhere to absolute confidentiality? So again, when reaching out to resources that might help safety planning, how are we going to make sure that our participants are, their confidentiality is respected and obtained? And then, how do you centralize survivor safety? And then you wanted to always, how is your safety planning going to be guided by the victim, survivor, your participant? You're going to want to think about those things. Because that's really, when we think about the philosophy of our work, we are only here to, further support participants in seeing their sacredness and their right to safety and their right to respect and their right to be treated with such and their right to kind of, determine where they want to go in our transitional housing program. So we really want to make sure that our safety planning looks like that. Like I said, it's in our program, we focus on safety planning once a month when we meet with our participants. It's part of the goals, but it's never, this idea that it's enforced. It's really, we want to make sure that we are just meeting their needs when it comes to safety, as that's the most critical piece in our work. So just keep those things in mind, and if you want the resources on our website at Redwind, Creating Sister Space, and if you can't find it, definitely email me and I can send you the electronic copy through email. And so if there are any questions right now, definitely feel free to place them in the box. And then, yeah.
You can also click up near the top on the arm button. That'll let us know that you have a question.
And then if something comes up after the webinar, feel free to email me or call me. I did put my cell phone here, but you can call me directly here in the office at 719-600-3939, extension 809. But if you need anything, any tools, if you are scattered site or if you're interested in the worksheet that we hand out to our participants when considering safety when looking for housing, you can definitely email me that too, and I can send you a copy.
All right, so it doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you, Raquel.
Oh, thank you.
Before we end the call, I want to let you know about our upcoming webinars, Securing Housing Options for Participants on December 19th, and Building Partnerships with Your Tribal Housing Authority on January 9th of next year. With that said, I'd like to thank our presenter, Raquel, our host, Alicia, from TA to TA, and all of you for joining us. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.